Cool. So I'll be talking about web apps in R with Shiny. So Shiny is a web application framework, just like any other web app framework, but it's written in R. So your code is the code you write is R code. It was written by Joe Chang and RStudio, and the first package that they put up was in 2012. So it's a little over, going to be 5 years old this year, later this year. And the cool thing is that it's an interactive experience that's all in R. So if you know how to write R, you know how to write a Shiny app. The question is just getting the syntax right. There's a few special functions. And it's ready for the enterprise. So if you look at some things that are on the RStudio website, they're really pushing a lot of their enterprise partnerships, and there are a lot of people that are using Shiny for their dashboards at their company. Big ones too, as you can see from some people on the list. So just to get an idea of what your Shiny app could look like, I think it's a good idea to check out these two links that I put on this page here, which give you examples of Shiny apps that other people have written. So here's a pretty cool one that they have, which shows in Minneapolis bus routes. And basically you can choose a time that basically these buses, their locations update. And it's telling you, okay, the data was refreshed 5 seconds ago, and now it's refreshed 10 seconds ago, and it's getting closer to when these dots will actually move on the screen to give you the location of the buses at this point in time. You can zoom in. You can have pop-ups on these markers. You can choose different bus routes and things like that. So fully interactive. And that's mainly done through, in this example, a package called Leaflet. And like you're working in R, you have packages that help you do certain things. For Shiny, there's a lot of packages that provide certain functionality in your web app. Leaflet is the best one if you want to do plotting on a map. Cool. So definitely go to those websites. You'll see a lot of really interesting apps that people have built, give you some good ideas for what you can do. So the prerequisites for building a Shiny app, I would say, is you have to have R and RStudio installed. The RStudio will help you with some of the things that you'll need while you're developing your app. You should probably have an intermediate understanding of R. If you've never used R before, you're just getting used to like base R. That's probably not a good thing for you. You want to really have a good grasp on how to import and export data, how to munge data or manipulate it with dplyr, and maybe ggplot as well. Not a requirement, but you should have at least an understanding of how those packages work, because the foundation of your Shiny app is going to be importing and exporting data, cleaning it up, and then probably presenting some visualization, whether or not it's with ggplot or if it's with Leaflet or some other method. At least you gotta know how those work. As I mentioned previously, there's an understanding of HTML, CSS, JavaScript is not required, but it's helpful for the people that have it so they can really tailor the experience to how they want. And then the last thing, really, as a prerequisite, you should probably have a strategy for how you want to share your Shiny app. Because you have to think about, you've got this thing you're going to develop and it's going to run locally on your computer, but it's a web application. People aren't going to probably be able to hit your computer over the web. You don't have the ports open, or your laptop's not even on all the time for them to hit it. So you're going to have to put it on a server, whether or not you privately own the server or whether you host it on Shiny's shinyapps.io website. I'll show later they'll host it for free. You can also embed them in Markdown documents and presentation documents. So just think about, hey, I'm going to share this app with people, like where are they going to need it? And pretty much it comes down to, in my mind, either you're going to host it publicly available on shinyapps.io for free, as long as you're okay with other people seeing the data, or you're going to have to maybe spin up an EC2 on AWS or some other server at work and install it there and run it there. So just think about that. And of course, requirement is you got to have the Shiny package. The Shiny package has all of the tools to build your app. So the bare minimum to create a project is to have 2 files. So when you get started building your Shiny app, you should create a folder for your app and put everything inside there. And these 2 files are the minimum components that you need. So you need to have a UI.r file that is your client side of your application. So if you're building a web app, the client side is the stuff that happens in the user's browser, their web browser. The server-side logic is going to be specified in a file called server.r, and that's all the stuff that when the code executes, it comes across from the client side, from the browser, actually runs on the server where your code is being hosted. And there are some examples that will show you how you can create a single file app that doesn't actually require to have one UI. Come on in. One UI.r file and one server.r file. You just can put both components in the same file and they execute. But I wouldn't really recommend having that one file to do your whole application because your application code gets pretty long. And so if you start mixing up what's on the client and what's on the server, it gets hard to understand which part you're actually modifying and what the behavior is. So I'd recommend if you're going to get started, just right away put two files in, and you'll see when I show you an example later. RStudio has the option when you create a new project to specify it as a Shiny app. It'll automatically create those two files for you and populate an example so you can get started right away. But that's really the bare minimum. Now that's the bare minimum. If you think about what you really should do, what I recommend is to take that bare minimum and then add the following three things. One is a file called global.r. So it could be a location for you to load packages and share data that need to be referenced on the client side and on the server side. So let's say on the client side you have a drop-down list, and the drop-down list has the days of the week in it, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. And on the server side, you need to filter elements out of that same possible list. It's shared between the client and the server. Instead of like putting it in one file and in the other file, and then maybe they become out of sync, you can put it in one file called global.r, and it's shared automatically between the two. And that's a kind of a trivial example. Another example which I think is nice is that the client side, the UI, and the server side depend on the library Shiny. You might as well just put library Shiny in the global.r file and have it referenced. You don't need to repeat that code and things like that. So that's one file that I recommend having. Another element I'd recommend having inside your project folder is a folder that is called www, which is for all your web resources. So this kind of goes back to developing web application. If you have images on your website, or if you have CSS, like cascading style sheets format, or you have JavaScript, all of that stuff should go in this www folder, because those are all web resources. Those are all resources that your app is going to use. They're sort of like, you can think of them as external dependencies that are not written in R that your app is going to have to reference. So as your app gets more complex and you add more features and functionality, it makes sense that you It makes sense that you create a separate folder that's www to keep all that stuff separate, and you can maintain it over there. And then lastly, I think it's important that you keep a folder in your app called data, and just have it be the main location that all data that's used in your app is located in. And this is really important if you're not connecting to a database. So let's say you have a list of customers and you're building a web app that like displays a list of customers and how much they purchased and what group, what type of customer they are, what kind of profile and something like that. You're going to have to load the data somehow, right? You might as well just keep everything, especially as you start adding more data sources to your app, in this folder called data. As I had alluded to, you can pull that stuff from a database. Shiny, just like in regular R, you can connect to databases and APIs and all that good stuff. You can just still do all that stuff. But if you go for the publicly hosted route, you put up the code on the server for Shiny Apps IO, they're probably not going to let you connect to an external database. And so that's one thing that might limit you, and you'll be forced to use this data folder. Unless you're going to be hosting it privately, then it's you can kind of pick. And so you'll notice as I'm going through a lot of the slides here, I have the superscripts and then references to talk a little bit more. There's so many articles about Shiny. I didn't want to rehash and read through the documentation that already exists. I just wanted to kind of talk about like why and how you approach the problem, because if you go back through the slides and you click on any of these links, it'll go in more depth as to like what is the global.r file, why you should have a web resources folder called www, and things like that. Do you have any questions now? I mean, I can answer questions now. Yeah.
So So I know like the www folder is like specific like Shiny package is for that stuff.
Yeah.
Is that the same with the global.r, or is that just like your implementation of it?
Yeah. So just like your UI should be called UI.r, that file, and your server should be called server.r. Those are like specific things that Shiny is looking for, and global.r is just another one. Yeah, that's by default. So global.r is and www is. Data is just something I made up for my projects. When I use R, I usually have a data folder.
I was loading everything on the server file, like all the packages.
Yeah, okay.
There's no problem with that.
There's not a problem with it. It's only when your client side, the UI, depends on those packages as well that you're gonna have to put them over there. So it just makes sense to sort of preemptively get around any of those issues by putting it in global, and you know that it's going to be viewed and usable on both sides. The thing is, usually the server side is where all your computation is happening, and the need for those packages are. So it's natural to put them there, but there are cases where on the UI side you'll need them too. So that was kind of just talking the abstract. Let's kind of look at some code. So in the UI.r file, I was saying it holds all the client-side logic. You'll notice it's got the library Shiny loaded. So this is an example where I just loaded it directly on the client, so it lets you know that you have to use it. This function, Shiny UI, comes from the Shiny package, and it just defines the metadata for an HTML page, just the page that shows up in your browser, like the head and the body. And then it's got a function called fluid page, which makes it expand and contract based on the dimensions of the device that it's being viewed on. So now your app is already sort of like mobile friendly because it'll shrink and move things around depending on the size of the screen and the device that it's being viewed on. And then you start to layer in additional functions. Most of these functions may be not familiar to you as R functions because they're specifically created for and exist in the Shiny package. So title panel provides a panel with the title of your app, and then this sidebar layout is this particular type of page style which has a left rail, really a well, that has a panel of inputs, and the main panel is on the right, and it's got all these things. So pretty typical of like a dashboard or something like that. You've got the controls on one side or one place, and then you've got the output of your controls somewhere else. And this will become more clear when I show you the example here in a minute. But as you'll see, we're sort of providing a skeleton for what the page should look like. You're providing some boundaries, and then you're putting stuff in it. So like I'm putting in a slider input, or just a little slider bar, and I'm saying, okay, the slider bar should go from 54 to 481, and I should start it at a value of 250. And then I'm saying in the other panel, let's output a plot, this plot called prediction plot. So that's what a really simple Shiny UI would look like. You specify sort of the skeleton for how the page works, and then you put elements inside of it, and these elements are usually called widgets. Now on the server side, you now have to think about, okay, what's going to drive those things that were on the client side? So the client side, we said we had a slider input, and then we had a plot. Well, it's going to take the input from the slider and then run some code and actually output the plot. So you've got this sort of connected loop. And what I'm doing here is sort of showing you, I'm going to read in some data, and then I'm going to fit a linear regression model and just call it model. This is pretty typical of our code, right? You have some data and you build a linear model. But then inside our server, we actually say render a plot that takes a data frame with the input from the client side and make a prediction and then plot this stuff. So this should at least be somewhat familiar to you if you've been writing our code previously, is how to create a data frame, how to fit a linear model, how to make a prediction out of the model, how to plot it using base plotting here, and adding some points and things like that. So I'm sort of breezing over, well, here's what it actually looks like. What I was talking about is that this part up here is the title panel. This is the sidebar layout. So it's a particular type of page that has this left well over here that has the slider input and then the plot that we generated. So you can build your Shiny app without even really creating an app. You can just do it in R first. Like, build your model, try plugging in new points, and make this plot. That R code you could have written without doing it, without even thinking about how Shiny works or whatever. So it's a good example of if you've already created analyses and you have plots and things like that, but they're not dynamic, but you think it would be helpful for someone else to view them dynamically, then you can take your existing code and just plop it in this framework. So I provided a link at the bottom where it's got the, in my GitHub, all of the code for this app. There's a nice function, and you'll see it as a way for people to share their apps with one another, especially if you're developing or troubleshooting, where you can specify the repository on GitHub that you're storing this in, your username, and then I provided it. It's actually a subdirectory, and the function is in the Shiny package. It's called run GitHub. You can actually run someone else's Shiny app directly from their code in GitHub. So if I open up my RStudio and I run this command, what it's doing is it's downloading the code that composes the Shiny app, and it's running locally on my computer. So you'll see that the URL is localhost with just some port that they make up not to clash with an existing one. And you can see here's how the app works. It responds to my input on the slider and moves the line along my regression. Not terribly exciting, but you know, you can at least sort of see what's happening there. So, questions right now? No? Okay. So, what's really happening is this magic that's called reactivity. So, in the UI side, if you're looking closely, there is this slider that you defined, and you said that it has an input ID of spend. And this other stuff is just other stuff to define what the slider input should look like, the label and the mins and the maxes and stuff. On the server side, you'll notice it had this function that every Shiny server has, which is Shiny server as a function of inputs and outputs. And it says, let's output something called prediction plot. And inside it had all that code about what I was doing to make the plot. But you'll notice it depended on something called input $spend. And you could think of the client side as input and the server side as output. It outputs things back to the client side. So the slider, whenever somebody changes its value, this value of input spend changes on the client or on the server side and forces the plot to be re-rendered. And that's what reactivity is. It's that whenever you have something on the UI, its value is cached. And so if the slider's at 250, the value on the server side is 250, and it regenerates your plot based on that, and you see the dot move along the regression line. And it doesn't actually rerun that code or that plot until I change the input again. And I change it to, let's say, 300 now, and it reacts to that change. And that's how you get this loop of client-side triggering server-side code to be executed that then gets outputted back to the client side, is that you've embedded certain parts that are looking for anything that's input $, and when those values change, it automatically recalculates everything. So if spend changed the plot, but it also changed a dropdown, which changed something else, it would just trigger a chain reaction. They would each be reacting to the change in one another's state. And so that's what makes the app interactive. You've got that relationship between the client side and the server side, and whenever those values change, they're recalculated. So that's it's a pretty well covered and talked about topic online. If you look at how you build a Shiny app, they go through a really detailed example of how one thing, a change in it, triggers downstream effects in your app to change. And so you just have to be aware of this concept of reactivity, because that's what makes your Shiny app work. So to recap some of the basics there, it's that you're going to have one folder for your app, and it's going to have a UI.r and a server.r, and it's going to have those other files. All the client-side stuff goes in UI.r, all the server-side stuff goes in server.r. The inputs, anything that have input $sign, the server.r can access it or pull it across, and anything that's output goes the other way. So you just have to, and that's why I started really talking about the client side and the server side, because it's all about passing information between the two. And as long as you know that the stuff passes between the two, reactivity is going to take care of everything else for you. Whenever one changes, it'll update the other. So that's the basics. So I'll go back to talking about how to format your app. So Shiny is based on a grid layout on the Bootstrap project. So this function called fluid page, it takes fluid rows and columns and things like that. There's articles online about how to style your Shiny app, but here's an example where typically your app is 12 blocks wide, and you can specify sub-rows or columns that have any sort of combination of those 12 blocks. And so here's one where it takes the page and makes sure that anything in the first fluid 12 goes all the way, stretch all the way across, and then segments the page in half, and you've got your 6 and 6, and then you've got even 6s within that other one. So you know how like when you're building a new web page or something, I had mentioned it probably looks like from the 90s, and if you're a bad front-end developer or web developer, it'll look like that. Shiny is trying to help you organize your elements in a pretty clean way so you don't have to worry about some of that stuff. And so there's some tips I have for your user experience that you'll want to think about. So every web page has a body, which is the text that you see when you open up the browser, but it also has a head. And the head is a place where you can specify things like the title and the icon, all that sort of stuff. And when you start to get more proficient in writing your apps, and you're writing apps for multiple people, and you want to reuse certain pieces of your code, including in the head something like CSS or the icon or the title or metadata that like when you post it in the Slack channel and it gets all that stuff that makes it look real nice, that link. You want to include that in your app by just saying tags head, tags link, and this is just more Shiny code that will generate the head for you, and you can put your CSS in there. The other thing is with your Shiny apps, typically the way the experience works is that the user will be entering something and then waiting for the result or something to change. And a lot of times that can be frustrating if you're building a process and it takes 5 seconds to run. There's not very many websites I use right now that take longer than a few seconds to do anything, right? So you have to think about what the user's thinking when they look at that website and like let them know what's happening. The machine on the server is running something and all that sort of stuff. So you'll want to maybe add a busy indicator that lets people know, hey, fitting your model or whatever. The person types something in, crunching the numbers or whatever you want to put. You can at least let them know what's happening. And then there's lots of opportunities to put custom JavaScript or use a package called Shiny.js that it really extends the interactivity and the experience for the user by putting more JavaScript in your app. So there's a lot of other cool stuff too. You can think about, well, if you want to track how many people are using your app, you might as well just sign up for a Google Analytics account and then put the tracking code in the top of your app. You got to think of yourself when you start developing these things like you're a web developer now. What do web developers do? They track people who use their app. They add all this stuff in here. They use databases. So if you want to connect to a database, just like you would in R Studio, you just say which library you need to connect to, in this case Postgres, make a connection and run a query and get the data, and then keep going. So there's really no limit, like I said, to what you can do in your app. You just have to think about, and the first thing I'm doing usually is like sketching out what do I want this experience to look like. The person's going to click on this button, and it's going to run and get data from here, and it's going to calculate some numbers, and you got to think about what the user experience is going to be like. And they even have really cool stuff, like here's an example of this package that's called DT. that you can actually search for values in the table, and here it's showing you that it's like updating a ggplot plot of the scatter plot based on what the person has filtered down in the table. So you might have like thousands of rows in your data set, and the user needs to only get to ones that relate to a certain client. They just type it in the search bar and they get all the data back and things like that. And these examples, it looks cool, and really you don't need to have that much experience. You just need to know which package to pull the code from and where to put it in your app, and you're good to go. So to run your app, I had mentioned having at least some plan for what you're going to do. If you're going to host your code on GitHub, or you're going to provide it in a GitHub gist, or if you're even just going to save it as a zipped file, you can run it with these commands. The other option is to host it for free on shinyapps.io. And I'll go to example and show you how I've linked my GitHub account with Shiny Apps, so that any time I update and push code to GitHub, it updates my apps on shinyapps.io. And there's the option to spin up your own server and do this. So that's the end of the presentation slides. I'll show you some more examples of kind of what's happening here with Shiny Apps, and then we'll go into some more of the code. So when I was over here, I was showing how to run the code from a particular command of the data that was stored in GitHub. If you go to shinyapps.io, you'll have to create an account first. There's this option to sign up. I've already got an account, so I'll log in. And what's cool about it is it lets you have a dashboard of how many applications you have running right now. So like I have like a few examples over here, and this is one that I had made for the meeting today. So when you look at it, it's pretty cool. It tells you like how many people were using it, what's the status of it, it's sleeping right now, the URL if you want to get to it, user metrics, all that kind of cool stuff that our studio is hosting this for you for free, which is really nice to have. So my app, you'll see like I have a little custom icon up there. It's a little bike. I was talking about in the head tag, you can define your icon. That's where you define that, your title. This actually just fits a clustering model based on some data, and it labels the clusters. And what's cool is like, oh, what would it look like if it had a different number of clusters? Well, what if it has 5 clusters? And I have a little progress wheel that says, hey, we're calculating some new clusters. And then you can see how it changes. Like, the clusters is based on the age of the person and the income. And this was for an example of someone who was starting a bike sharing business, and they weren't sure what customer demographics would segment into. Like you can see that people who ride bikes who are in their 20s typically earn less than $60,000, and that's one cluster. There's people that make between $60,000 and $100,000 that are in their mid-20s to 40, and then there's people that make over 100,000 in that same demographic, and that's a third cluster. And you can see a summary of what those clusters are in terms of age and income and things like that. And then what's cool is we had a list of fake names that were people, and they're classified into a cluster that of what one they belong to, so that we can run a marketing campaign. So I could say, let's run an email campaign only to people that are in cluster 2, and get that data there, and then download it. And so I can download a CSV of the table data that's inside the app. And so I'd say from my experience, personally, that's a pretty big feature for people when you're working in an office setting, is they want to run the analysis and do some more of their own number crunching in Excel. Like, so you might as well just present the data and give it to them, but in a way where they can keep working on it. But the reason for doing this particular app with clustering is because clustering is hard to run, and people are usually a little finicky or fussy about how many clusters did you pick and why did you pick them. And there's really no reason why we couldn't pick other ones. If you wanted to cluster people in different ways, go ahead. And that's kind of what the app could be used for. So all that code is hosted in my GitHub, and how that really works from scratch is, let's say in RStudio you want to create a Shiny app. You just have to say, I'm going to create a new project, and instead of saying empty or R, you say Shiny Web App. And you can give it a name. I'll just call it test for now. Oops, it exists. Let me try it again. Do you think there's a test 2? I'll go test 3. So what I had mentioned previously is that when you select a new project and you select Shiny app, it'll automatically populate for you a UI.R and a server.R. And you can see here, it's very similar to the example that I was showing you, where you load the Shiny library, you define a user interface with a fluid page to be expandable, and then it's got the same sort of layout and paneling and stuff like that. And you'll have this option within RStudio to run your app to see what's happening. And there's even a little smaller caret below that can allow you to choose where to run it. So like, just by default, I'm selecting run in the viewer pane, which is down over here. So when I click run app, it's going to be using that code to produce the app down here. And I can play with it down here. The problem with that, and what I don't recommend is doing that, is because you're building a web application and you might want to inspect some of the elements as if they were in your browser and that sort of experience. The viewer really is only just to give you some idea of what's happening. I don't think it's the best way. And that's why typically in my settings for RStudio, I set it to run the Shiny application in the system's default web browser, so that when I do that and click Run App, now it's going to automatically pop open a new tab in my browser and I can look at it. Like some stuff that maybe people who are not familiar with web development would know really about is that you can edit and look at your code and modify it here if it's client-side stuff. So like, here's my body, and I've got this header called Old Faithful. I can just edit it and take that out, and you'll see what the app looks like without that. You're running the app, but you can still change everything on the client side if you're interested in doing that. So you can try to do different things to test the styling and things like that that you might not do. You might be testing a lot in RStudio. I think the tendency for people who are new to this would think like, I have to like change the code in the app and then rerun the app, but you don't have to change everything. If it's on the client side, I think you can really do a lot of your styling and stuff in the browser here. A good example would be, so for this particular container, I can add some styling that says the margin on top of this thing should be 100 pixels. And you'll see how it just went down really far. And I'll put it to 10, 50, 100, whatever. You can kind of see how you can mess with the layout and the look of it while it's actually running. Yeah, so this is, you'll have to think about whatever that change was and add it to your app in R. So once you get the app to a place where you're happy with it, there's the option within RStudio to publish, and this is what's actually hooked up to Shiny Apps.io. So I've already went through a step which links my account. It's pretty easy to do. You can just say publish application, and what it's going to do is take, it's telling me I need to update some of my packages. So it'll just take your UI.R and your server.R and anything that's associated with this project and just wrap it all up, throw it over to Shiny Apps.io servers, and they'll start running it.